Hi, and welcome to the Uplift with Dabney Brice, the podcast where we'll elevate global stories by shining a spotlight on underrepresented narratives, educating ourselves about current and historical events and diverse cultures and communities. Let's journey together to step outside our comfort zones, uplift each other, and make the world a little bit better along the way. Welcome, my uplifters. It's your girl, Dabney Brice. Today's episode features Brenda Martinez, a fourth-year PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin. I've known Brenda since my undergrad days, and I've always been impressed by her drive and her boldness. She's a proud Salvadorian woman who's a champion and an ally for first-generation students and the BIPOC community at large. Brenda is truly someone to look out for in the years to come, and I cannot wait for y'all to hear her story and also her book recommendations, because homegirl got a list, y'all. She really do. So let's dive in and let's get started. So thank you, Brenda, for coming on. I'm really excited to have you here. Before I ask you the questions or we start talking, I just wanted to tell our listeners how we know each other, and why it's still weird to call you Brenda for me, because I'm so used to calling you APM. So for those of you that don't know, I met Brenda through Lehigh University. We went to undergrad together. She was a senior when I was a freshman, and I met her through the Summer Scholars Institute, the Lehigh University Summer Scholars Institute, which was for first-gen students, aka Lucy, so that we could basically learn about Lehigh, learn about college and the resources that were available to us before we got started at a university. And she was my TA slash RA slash mentor. You were just there.
every corner.
You were every corner. We would always hang out in her room and listen to her and like learn about what Lehigh was really like through her. And then she also taught like one of the classes, the English classes that we did. And then she has one thing about Brenda is that she's really good at persuasion, and she's really good at, well, like, because she believes in, she's passionate about it, but like she'll get you to do things. And she convinced me. She tried so hard. She was like, you need to be a sister of Lambda Theta Alpha Latin Sorority Incorporated. And I did not want to be a part of Greek life at first. I was very much against it. All I thought was like mainstream Greeks that you see on TV and movies. But then she taught me what LTA was really about. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll join. And she was my assistant pledge mistress, and I've never looked back. So she's also my sister. So like mentor, sister, all the things, friend. So yeah, and that's like, you've done so many amazing things, not only for me, but for other people, and for your field, and just for other first-gen students. And you've always inspired me. You were always someone that I've looked up to, and I wanted to almost emulate especially when I was a baby freshman. I was like, how can I be this person? Like, how can I be her? So I felt like having you on this podcast, I couldn't be selfish with just knowing what I know about you. I had to share you with the world, because you're going to do really great things. And so y'all heard it here first. Y'all know Brenda here first. And when she explodes, you could just remember, like, oh yeah, I remember hearing about her on Dabney's podcast. So here we are. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I appreciate that path down memory lane, because I'm sitting here like, oh my God, that's such a long time ago. But it's funny, because to hear you say that, I kept thinking about when I first met you. I was sitting here like, wow, if I was this focused and dedicated as a first year, like imagine how far I could have gone. Because my first impression was like, you were eager, you were curious, you had all the questions about like classroom, how Lehigh worked, opportunities. And from the jump, I saw that you were a go-getter. So I'm very pleased that I was able to recruit you because I knew that you could change not just Lehigh's landscape, but LTA. And like I knew that you were already teaching me what sisterhood meant. And I've seen you mentor other young women at Lehigh and beyond, and that always means a lot. So I was actually looking up to you when I first met you. I was like, can she talk to my little brother before he goes to college? Because he needs some of this. So,
meanwhile, I wanted you to talk to my little brother before he went to school too. So we're equal on that.
Yeah, the brothers always need a little push.
Mm-hmm. We're older sisters, by the way, so we get each other that way too. Yeah. I guess I gave you a long spiel about you, but if you could just introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us more about who you are and your background, and what you do currently.
Great. Well, my name's Brenda. A fun thing to know about me is that my middle name's Giselle, and I've always loved it. And I've tried to get people to call me that. It's never worked out. So I'm like about to hit, 30 in 3 years, and I still haven't accomplished the one goal that I want is for people to call me Giselle. But I am from South Central Los Angeles, and my parents are from El Salvador. So they're Salvadorian refugees, migrated to LA. And then I left Los Angeles at 17 to go to Lehigh, which is where I met Dabney. So I left very young, and I always knew I wanted to leave Los Angeles. I grew up in a community that often is framed by its violence and its lack of resources. And while that may be structurally true, like I also grew up in a community full of love and kinship. And I went to King Drew Magnet High School. And it was a public school, all Black and Latino students. And it was a college prep school. So everybody was pushed to go to UCLA, UC Berkeley, USC, like the Callies. Mm-hmm. And I was one of the few that was like, oh, I'm not interested in that. Like, I want to leave Los Angeles. I want to know what's out there, mostly because of the seasons. So when I went to Lehigh, I wasn't someone who was like, oh, I want to major in this. That was never how I thought about it. I was literally like, oh, college is my ticket out. That's the only way I understood college. So when I came to Lehigh, I was majoring in architecture because that's something that I've been studying. Then I switched to English, added journalism because I thought that was the practical side of things. And then through the Lucy program and having my own mentors, I realized that I wanted an opportunity to keep studying. So I pursued my master's at Lehigh, stayed there for 2 more years, which I was grateful for. And my mentors kept pushing me to go to grad school. And so now I'm a PhD student at UT Austin, PhD candidate. So I'm currently working on my dissertation, like literally just started working on it this semester. And I don't know what's beyond that, but something that I'm realizing about myself is that, yes, I've always been a scholar. And a lot of first-gen students of color tend to be, because we reproduce knowledge in ways that the academy doesn't validate, nor is it ready for, but it's the one they need. However, what I realize about myself is that I've always been interested and really great at building community, sustaining those communities, and like just mentoring other people. So something I'm excited about after I get my PhD is I don't know if the academy is going to be a place for me anymore. And I have a lot of feelings about that. But my scholarship right now is on reproductive justice and U.S. multi-ethnic American literature. So that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. So I guess, and we're going to get through all of that. Like I have questions about everything that you've kind of just said, but let's, I guess, like take it back a little. I would love to know. So one thing about you that I've always noticed throughout my time with you at Lehigh and beyond is you have almost this natural ability to think beyond what others think of you, whether you realize it or not. And you speak your mind about things that you are passionate about, whether that's uplifting and fighting for first-gen students, undocumented immigrants, women, and just breaking boundaries within academia currently, even though you're not, you haven't received your PhD yet, like you're on the way, and just spending, how long have you been in academia now? You've been a long time. You've been
4 years of college, 2 masters, and I guess 4 PhDs. So 10 at this point.
That's wild. So 10 years within the academic bubble. I would love to know, where did you get this ability from? Like, where did that come from? Um, and how, like, obviously it had to start somewhere, and how you've been able to like hone that in, um, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So where did that, like, the stamina to stay in here?
Yeah. Like, how were you able to get through 10 years of academia, but just in general, your life? Like, you've always spoke, like, I know what you've done even before Lehigh. Um, so how have you been, like, where did you get that ability to be so passionate about these things, speak up for injustices in our country and around the world? I would love to know more about that.
Thank you for that question. I don't
Mhm.
think I've ever been asked that. And I'm like, oh, I really have to think about this.
Yeah.
But when you first asked that, I kept thinking, it's the books. Like,
Mm.
it was the books. Like, I was always a reader since I was a little girl. And as you know, they don't really teach Black literature, Black history, at least not for me growing up in the LAUSD district. But I found the library, and it was my best friend, and I would read and read and read. And I didn't realize this until like high school when I started having to think about it. But a lot of my reading that I did for fun was Black literature. So I came across Toni Morrison in middle school. You know, like,
Wow.
my studies began very, very young. And for me, it was just the stories. So even though I'm an English lit person, I wasn't like, oh, what about the form? And like, there was none of that. It was just stories, right? And so I read Malcolm X, I read Assata Shakur, I read Toni Morrison. Like, I was reading these folk very, very young, and I was deeply inspired by both what I was reading and what I was seeing in my community. So LA, California, Oakland, like, our state is very well known for the activist atmosphere, and for the way people have constantly have to fight and stand up for themselves in multiple ways. So I think it was a combination of like being bred in Los Angeles, specifically South Central, going to school in Compton, but also the reading that I was doing. My first teachers, aside from my parents, were these scholars, these writers,
Mm.
that at the time I wasn't like, I didn't know. Well, of course, like when you get to the end of Malcolm X, like, you know, he's not here. But like, for many, many days as I was reading these people in my head as like a young person, I'm like, oh, they're alive. Like, I need to meet them. Like, these people changed the game for me. So I think it's just what I consumed very young. Um, what I researched, like, I started researching the Black Panthers very, very young, because the alphas and AKAs would always come down to my elementary and do a lot of after school activities for us. And they were always teaching us about like organizations like the Black Panthers. And so my like education has always been rooted in like Black radical thought. And I think,
Mm.
and no, I know that that's why I am the way I am. And I'm very grateful for being grounded in that tradition.
Yeah, I think the way that you mentioned books, I think that's amazing that you were able to get that so young, and learn that at such a young age, because I that's how I felt about you when I first met you. Just like a little, like, I was like, oh, like, she's like Lehigh's Malcolm X. She's like Lehigh's like like, you're all these, for you, like, to me, you were like a civil rights leader at Lehigh. I don't know why I'm putting in quotes. You were Lucy. If long story short, the reason we got Lucy is because of Brenda and other people and the hard work of Black and brown students at Lehigh University. But I like to convert, I guess, to compare that with like my own experience. Like, I didn't know, I grew up in a mostly like white neighborhood, never had a Black teacher or someone that looked at me until Lehigh. And so I was never introduced to Malcolm X and Toni Morrison until Lehigh, until Lucy, honestly, when we had to take a dig deeper into Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and all the others. Which is, it's, I know that's not my fault. That's just, unfortunately, the nature of the US education system, that we're still fighting against right now. And so you were one of those people that introduced that to me. And I can see how that's influenced you all the way till now, and how that still influences you, because you always come back to Lehigh in some way, shape, or form. And not just Lehigh, but all the communities that you touch. You do not leave any community untouched. Everywhere you go, like California, Lehigh, Austin, you're in Jersey now, and I know that's because of a lot of it's pandemic reasons. But once things open up again, I can imagine what you'll do in Jersey. Like that, I just want to let you know that that's very admirable. And I encourage all my listeners to, all the people that she just like named, and we're gonna get more into books too, because I got fun questions about books later. And I'll make sure to put in the episode notes all the people that you tell me, so that the listeners can go out and buy their work too. I guess to move on, like speaking of, you mentioned mentorship earlier. So like if someone listening right now does not have a mentor, or at least doesn't think they have one right now, what would you say to them in order to try and find one, ask for one? Like what advice would you have for that person?
I would definitely, my advice would be to sit down and listen. Listen to yourself. Where do you go when you're feeling down? And where do you go when you have questions? Because there has to be someone. And they might not be the traditional mentor the way we might talk about them, but they are. They're a place that you go to for refuge. They're a place that you go to where they remind you who you were before you began whatever process you're in. There's someone who's constantly challenging you, constantly asking you, do your values align with what you're doing? Are you doing this just because you're following the status quo? These tough conversations, they're there. It might be your cousin, it might be your auntie, it might be your mom, but they're there. And if folks are looking for a mentor in an industry or professional field that they're looking for, I've been doing this a lot lately. I've just been listening to podcasts or documentaries, going on LinkedIn and just Googling people that I'm admiring from afar. Sometimes you feel like you know that person, but you don't.
All the time.
All the time. But you follow them. It's worth a shot reaching out. And maybe it's Issa Rae. Maybe you reach out and
Issa Rae is my mentor in my head.
Exactly. She can't email you back, but she has podcasts, she has interviews. So I also recommend people tap into those resources that people are creating for you so that you can always return to. That's another type of mentorship, even though if you can't get a real life Q&A, right? But one day you can. Maybe you'll run into a mentor of Issa Rae's, and then that's how you start the triangle or the connection, the circle. But I would say listen to the mentors you have, and then think about the mentors you want and figure out ways where you can access them, whether that's an interview that's been posted or maybe you can send them a LinkedIn message. But 9 times out of 10, I've noticed, and I'm sure that people will get back to you because they've been there before and they want to help you.
Yeah, I agree. And what you said, it doesn't have to be the traditional view of what we think mentorship is. It doesn't have to be someone that you even know. It doesn't have to be oh, I have to call them every single week, and talk to them about such and such. No, I have, you're a mentor to me because you are older, and wiser, and you've been through, especially with grad school, because I've lucky enough to have gotten my master's, asking you questions and watching you do your master's at Lehigh, even though we're not in the same field. And we're passionate about some of the same things. I could still look up to you and emulate you, or try to follow your footsteps. But then there's people there's spiritual mentors, there's financial mentors, there's you could talk to them every day, or you could talk to them at once every 3 months. It's whatever you need. You define what mentorship means to you. And I think especially for Black and Brown people, that's mentorship is so important, especially for if you're Black and Brown and first generation. If you don't know what first generation is, it's there's first generation American, then there's first generation college student. So if you're first generation American, it means your parents were not, or one or both of your parents were not born in the United States. They immigrated here, and you were the first to be born in the United States. If you're a first-gen college student, you may not be a first-gen American, but you're the first to go to college in your family. So just definition for them if you don't understand. Learn something new every day. I didn't realize how important mentorship was until undergrad, and like even post academia for me, and like during a pandemic, what does mentorship look like? So like in just hearing you say, like, you've just been reaching out to people through LinkedIn and DMs, and my motto is just like, you might as well try. Like, the worst that they could say is no.
Yeah.
And then you're just back to where you are. Like, no one hurt you. Like, you're fine.
You're alive. You're still here.
You're alive. Continue. I think that's a lot of people get in their heads about it. Sometimes I do too. And that's another thing about a mentor to have, is that they will, like, right before this, Brenda was telling me to relax. Like, she was like, you're fine. Continue. Yeah. It's like, you're right. I am fine.
You need that extra person to like bounce ideas off, to listen to you in ways that you can't listen to yourself yet. And that's true what you said about, you know, Black and brown, first gen, whether that means American or college student. It's often because we don't have the established networks already. It's up to us to create that. But I think that's such a great opportunity, because we find and create communities in such creative ways that I've always been grateful for. Because you're right, they don't have to be in your industry or field. It might just be that there's another first gen out there that has a very similar story to yours, or different, and you can learn from it. So it's really about being open-minded, because those mentors can connect you to maybe the next mentor that might help you get that internship if that's what you're looking for. So it's just about building community. I know that we use like mentorship, network as a language, but for a lot of us, we know that means it's about finding and building community.
Exactly. That's perfect. I guess that's it. You said it. You always say it so well too. I guess speaking of first gen, besides you being first generation yourself, I know that that's always been a common theme in your work since Lehigh, and like, you've never forgotten to speak up and fight for first generation students. And I want to know, because there's one thing to be first gen and it's another thing to fight for first gen. So I want to know, like, why did you decide to do that? And why have you continued to do that since?
For me, I realized that I've always appreciated being an advocate and an ally for someone, because often I needed that person when I was young, and I didn't necessarily have it. And so for me, it's been really important that if I see students who, you know, might need extra support or resources, to one, provide that for them, or two, like maybe get the universities to provide that, because that's what they should be doing anyways, and supporting all these students who need specific type of resources. And like, I keep thinking, I'm first gen American and first gen college, right? And so I keep thinking about the days when I was young, my brother and my parents, you know, sometimes they needed like taxes or files translated for them, or like you just had to call up, you know, that company for them, because they might not have like the certain words in English, or just not know English at all. So I'm thinking, like, that's for a lot of us, that's where it starts. Like, you advocated for your parents, you advocated and spoke up for your family, and then you go into these like new structures. Like for us, it's the university, college setting. And you're kind of in that position where I'm like, oh, I don't know where to go to figure out the FAFSA. I've seen these other people get funding for conferences. Where is that coming from? People are getting internships. How are they fixing their resume? So like, you come in with questions and you don't know where to go. And as a first gen BIPOC student myself, it was being first gen in addition to being a woman of color, in addition to coming from a low income working class family. So there was so much that I came with. I don't see myself as a deficit. Like, I think I have a lot of cultural wealth, but there was other stuff that I didn't know how to navigate. So as I was figuring it out, as I was slowly finding my way, I realized, okay, there are other students here who are also trying to figure it out. How about we make it easier for them, so that it's not like a Where's Waldo situation,
Mm-hmm.
but so that there's like a nice little handy list of resources, maybe like faculty, you can go into. So I think it starts from that place. Like I wish I had that earlier on before I got to high school. I think it would have made a world of a difference. And once I had it, it did make a world of a difference. And so I just want to make sure that other folks have that too.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that because I, coming to Lehigh without Lucy, um, my first year would have been a whole lot different than if I didn't have Lucy. And I know that there are, like, I've had friends who didn't do Lucy that are first gen were like, oh, like, yeah, we see the difference. But the thing that was beneficial with us being a part of Lucy is that we were able to spread that to other first gen that weren't a part of the program as well. But yeah, like you said, like if I could go back and tell high school me all these things, because like Lucy like did a great job, but it still wasn't like fully, it's not fully comprehensive because you can't, like we only had 3 weeks. You can't do everything in 3 weeks. And then a lot of our TAs and mentors were also first gen themselves. So like they were just 3 years ahead of us, but then they're still like post Lehigh life that they didn't know, that now they're telling, like Brenda's telling me as she like, it's all like following in your footsteps, but like you'll like report back to us, be like, oh yeah, by the way, this is what grad school is like, or
Yeah.
by the way, this is what how you write a cover letter or a resume, and this is how you do interviews, and like this is how you find an apartment, this is how you pay your taxes, like this is how
Life.
you budget. Like
Exactly. And I think and honestly, like the older I grow and the more I'm doing a lot of like self-reflection and journaling and trying to figure out, like, that was one of my questions. Like, why do I keep coming back to this type of work? Like, there's
mm-hmm.
something there. And it might be just for me, but I've talked to other first gen, especially from migrant communities or just POC communities. And we're taught that education will be our path to social mobility. And I get
Mm-hmm.
that because our parents are often immigrants or income working class. And so they see higher education as kind of like the ticket for their children to get access to better resources, a better life, right? And that's fair. However, as you know, and I know, that there's something new happening with like the amount of student debt that students are getting into, with the fact that a lot of first gen students are told, or they believe they want to be doctors and lawyers, and then they get to college and realize, oh, like my interests are different, they're expansive, but maybe I'm in a college where that major isn't supported. Or
Mm-hmm.
like maybe I could have done like my general eds at a community college where, by the way, the teachers are actually there to teach you and support you, and they're great mentors. So I think that community college is a space for a lot of us where we
Mm-hmm.
could thrive, and not get into debt and then
Yeah.
transfer up. Like I realize that I'm very passionate about this because I drank the Kool-Aid myself and really believed that education was a path to social mobility, and it may be for some, but it can't be for all. And that's a structural inequality that I think that we really need to address. But for those
Mm-hmm.
that are in the academy, I'm very persistent in like, let's get you the resources, because like you were saying, right, like you can come back and tell the younger folk, like, if you choose this route, make sure you do A, B, and C, or make sure you get A, B, and C.
Moving forward, I want to get into your PhD and your research. And so you're currently fourth year as a PhD candidate at, well, at UT Austin, but you're, because of the pandemic, you moved back to
Jersey.
Jersey. And you're getting it in English, I believe.
English literature. Yeah.
English literature. Um, so can you talk a little bit about how that experience has been for you so far, and also just getting into your dissertation and your research?
Um, the experience went from 0 to 100. Like, you knew me at Lehigh. I've
Mm-hmm.
always been a very involved person, both in the community and on campus. And so I admit this to people who ask me, like, my master's program was great, but I was not dedicated to my research as a master's student. I was dedicated to Lucy. I was
Mm-hmm.
dedicated to LTA. I was dedicated to OMA, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, right? And so I was always dedicated to programming, to my students, to just creating spaces and building connections between South Bethlehem and Lehigh University. So when I came to UT, I felt the first gen strongly again, where I was like, oh, I wasn't trained to think about publishing. I wasn't, mentored to think about fellowships. Like, this is new and this is scary, and I think I'm out of my league here. So it was very, very scary going from Lehigh, which is an R2 institution, to UT, which is a Research 1 institution, which means that the emphasis really is on research, and not so much teaching. They say it's valued. It could be in some places, but it's really about research. That, and Lehigh's a private school, smaller numbers, and UT is this large state school. So it's also overwhelming in size. But I've been in English since sophomore year. So I switched majors sophomore year. So this is technically my field. But there's this other weird thing where at Lehigh, I was in English, but most of the classes I took were in Africana studies. So a lot of the classes from that program were cross-listed with English, and you best believe most of my classes were in Africana studies. So coming to UT, I felt like I wasn't properly trained in English. I wasn't properly, prepped to think about research in this way, fellowships in this way. All I know is how to support other students like me, and what is this? So it was a big culture shock, and I had to learn fast. And my time at UT has been very different. But I'm really proud to say that I did what most of us always do as first gen, is I figured out where the resources were. I used them immediately, and I started building the network of support that I needed at UT to thrive. So I took classes with all the professors I read about that seemed interesting. I developed a relationship with them, and through my classes at UT and thinking about my work at Lehigh, I realized, I've always been dedicated to Black studies. That's what helped me get to where I am. So I've been dedicated in Black studies. I read widely, but always mostly authors of color. So I realized that about myself. And the things that I read as like a undergrad, like This Bridge Called My Back, by Gloria Anzaldúa, Sherry Moraga, like, were things that were written by women of color who understand that theory is in the flesh. Theory is what we live through, and how it changes the way we see the world. So all these three things came together for me at UT. And I'm proud to say that my research is at the intersection of 20th and 21st century U.S. multi-ethnic American literature, Black studies, and women of color feminisms. So that's what I do broadly, and that's what I've always done. But coming to UT, I finally got the language to say, oh, this is what I'm doing then. There's a word for this. So that's kind of how I got to UT.
So I guess for those that don't know, could you give what, as best as you can, a simplified version of what that means, and like what's the goal of your dissertation, and what are you learning to sort of, you're trying to defend something is a dissertation. Like, this is your main point, this is what you're defending. So I guess if you could explain what it is within that you're doing.
Yes, so I can start there. Actually, okay. It's a great question, because I wish I knew this coming in. So my three intersections, right, are like 20th and 21st century. That's important, because all that signals is that it's contemporary. I like to do contemporary work. U.S. multi-ethnic literature. So it's, like I said, Toni Morrison, like Malcolm X. Like, I'm thinking about the stuff I've always read and I've enjoyed, and I love teaching. So those are my limits, my scope. So a lot of us are well-read in various fields, but when you pursue a dissertation, you have to figure out what your limits are. So for me, that was one of my limits. Like, I'm interested in contemporary, multi-ethnic American literature. So I'm not necessarily focused on writing on like things that are like literature that's from Central America, the Isthmus, but U.S. Central American. Yes. So that's part of my limit. Black studies, because as I said, I've been trained in Africana studies. So a lot of like my framework is shaped, always influenced by Black feminisms. So that's where that comes from. And then women of color feminisms, because I'm noticing that different fields like disability studies, we have like great scholars like Sammy Shock, who wrote a new piece, and I can link that to you too for the episode, about how women of color authors and activists have always been theorizing disability studies. And maybe they haven't been using the word disability studies, but we've been doing it all along. When we're critiquing these systems, when we're critiquing about how the medical field does not listen to Black women's pain, like, that's disability studies. And that's something that women of color, Black, Indigenous, and women of color have always been doing. So that's why that's the third thing that I say I study is women of color feminisms, because it opens up to all these other fields that I've been interested in for a while. So I like to keep it broad because I'm interested in too many things. And as a PhD student, they tell you like, you're going to be an expert on something. I don't know what that is yet, because I still feel like, like I'm reading everything and
Yeah.
interested in everything, but maybe at the end of the disc, I'll let you know what I'm an expert on.
I mean, I'm not surprised that you're like everything, like it's broad for you, because I mean, I like that about you too, because you're multifaceted, and like a lot of these issues are multifaceted and have different components. And so it's hard to just like narrow it down to like maybe one specific topic or one specific group of people. Cause it's like, well, everyone else somehow gets involved when you're telling the story anyway. So why limit yourself to just that? I guess going into that, I want to talk about a little bit about your background too in Central America, because I know that you do tend to also discuss about things that are happening there. Your parents are from El Salvador, and that's very important to you. You're very proud to be Salvadorian, and Latina and first gen. And so I guess like, cause you've sent me some articles that I will make sure to link in the episode notes so y'all can read as well. But most of them have been geared towards, like, I would say like what is happening in Central America currently and what our perceptions are of what's happening there. And if you could talk a little bit more about those articles / like what's happening in Central America and sort of what's it called, like the history behind it, because just from reading like the abstracts of it, I see the similarities to like my own experience in learning about Haiti, because that's where my parents are, and there's like the reoccurring theme when it comes to like US influence in these countries and the stereotypes of that, oh, they're bringing violence, and they're like the reason why there's a refugee crisis, a lot of it is history and what has happened when the US has gotten involved. And that's why you're seeing it the way it's played out on the media, and not necessarily the actual like story and like what Central Americans want you to know. So if you could, I hope that's my question's helpful and that you can, just talk about those things.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so I do tend to post a lot about, like you said, what's happening currently in Central America, but also I try to repost and reshare pieces written by like Central American journalists, so people who are like in those countries in the field, because as you know, like you having a Haitian background, oftentimes in America, we act like we are the experts of everything and that like we know what's going on in everywhere in the world. And apparently we miss what's happening in places like Flint, Michigan. So that's like an American
which
thing.
Still has no clean water, by the way.
Exactly. No clean water. But yet here we are again intervening in other countries, creating like, the crisis in other countries. It's something that we often do. So the reason I pursued my PhD as well is because I didn't have the resources or like options to take classes at Lehigh on Latino history. So we had a Latin American studies department and I took a few classes there, but the classes that I took or that were always offered were mostly like, Argentina and Spain. And as a Central American woman, like I didn't see the options to learn about like my region or my family's history. So I came to UT because they had like a Mexican American Latino studies program. They had a Latin American studies program, LILAS. So I saw that there was more options. And so in my PhD studies, I've come to see that I would like to have a conversation about Black, Indigenous, and Central American studies together and like how these communities are in conversation with each other. And they're often not one or the other, right? Because there are Black Central Americans, for example. So for me, what I've been posting about recently is because of what's been happening for us in El Salvador with President Bukele, who's
Mm.
not someone that I stand for, and whose policies are often more aligned than not with Trump's administration.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen what's been happening there. I've been paying attention to those journalists. I've been talking to some of my cousins. And it's a very jarring experience, because I'm sure maybe you've had experience with this, but like when you talk about politics or history with your like Haitian family members who either grew up there or still there, majority of life is there, and then they come here,
Mm-hmm.
and then you as like a student who's been learning and reading and have like these critiques about the government and the history, there's often pushback. There's often like, well, you don't understand, like
Mm-hmm.
that's not how it is. So a lot of what I've been doing is having to learn, read, synthesize, write it out on my own. And then when I'm writing, have these conversations with family members and question like, where is, the, not like, well, the questioning happening, but also like the pushback, like, why is this pushback happening? Why are we so defensive?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it has to do with, I don't know if we're there yet, and I'm saying as a field, because Central American Studies as a field, I can't speak for Central American Studies community or the field itself, but what I'm seeing in the field is a lot of us are still high-key tied to the nation state. So we become defensive because we can't bear critique of like El Salvador itself, because we're still talking about U.S. intervention, which of course had a play, like of course, but the Salvadorian government itself is causing harm, and like we need to call that out. Also, like when we're thinking about, again, my country, El Salvador, it wasn't always El Salvador, right? Just like the U.S., they were indigenous land. And so what happens when the nation state comes in and the government comes in, and then we decide we're El Salvador, and then the flag comes out. So it's all these like complicated interwoven histories that still feels very tender to some, oftentimes even myself, because as an American, I'm also mindful of like, okay, I'm going to pay attention to what the U.S. is doing because I'm not in El Salvador. My families are there, my cousins are there, so I see them as the experts, and maybe like we can have a dialogue about what I've been seeing and learning, and some of my questions, and kind of engaging in that way. So right now, where my studies have taken me are very much about U.S. intervention in Central America, and thinking about how that shapes, like you said, not just the Central American refugee crisis, but like, for example, my family's story, how that shapes many of us who came in like 70s, 80s, and 90s, when we weren't really the topic of conversation, right? Like we weren't coming up. This has been quote unquote a recent trend only because the world decided to see us.
Yeah.
But we've been here, we've been migrating, and we've been suffering from U.S. intervention. What worries me though is that I think that the way the world is shaping us is kind of like what Trump said, quote unquote, we're a shithole country. There's violence, MS-13, like all of these,
I know the word, I know what you're saying.
I know, like, basically they're racializing us.
Yeah.
That we're like carriers of violence. Or they're characterizing us in like just a place where it really is just a shithole. And that's something that I'm worried about also as someone who's studying this, because there's joy, there's resistance, but sometimes also not all our stories are about resistance. Some of us are just trying to survive, and we need to nuance that. So I've been posting about it because I would love for people to be more aware, like non-Central American communities to be more aware, because there's so much overlap when we think about what's happening in the United States to other communities of color, and what's happening in countries beyond, right, the US. So it's like we need to think about how we can globally support one another against these states, because there's so much violence that comes for all of us. And I've just been posting and learning and wanting to write about it more because it impacts me in the way I think about my family story. Like the reason I'm here is because the US intervened.
Yeah.
Like,
period.
Yeah. And it's like, let's talk about that, and not just the current crisis, right? But like history, because it goes back. I have a friend who does like 19th century Central American studies, and her research is amazing. And it's like she's tracing it all the way back. And it goes back further than that, but like she's really starting somewhere where we're also not even talking about in the field right now.
Mm-hmm. I love that you said that, because I already see like the connections, especially when it comes to like shithole country, like Haitian, like there's a reason certain countries are being labeled as these right now, and how that affects those, like you said, those communities in the US currently, not just the ones like our family that are back home, but us that are here as well. And so like if you're listening, like you have to pay attention to that. And that's why I wanted to start this podcast, was because I wanted people to think more deeply, than what they're receiving at face value. So you hear like there's a current refugee crisis from Central America, but there's more to that. They didn't just up and decide, oh, I'm coming to the US today. Like there's, like you said, it goes even further back to the 19th century. And I'm such a history nerd, so like my brain will be like, okay, what happened in the 19th century? But even if you're not a history nerd like I am, I'll definitely make sure that, like, Brenda, if you could send me some resources that either you have or like that you've received from other people, so that people can learn more. I guess just to continue moving on the conversation, what is something that's not violence related, not stereotypical related, that you want people to know about either Central America or El Salvador, like as a whole?
Again, so I'm gonna speak from like my family's local point, right? My parents are from San Pedro Perulapan, and so I had the pleasure of visiting once for like 3 months. And something that I would like for people to know, and I'm sure other like Central American diasporic people might connect with this, was we have like a tradition. Like my mom told me that like when folks get married, oftentimes from the church to like the El Pueblo, like they would ride on like horses or like cars, and like the village of people, like your community, your family members would be behind you cheering you on. And so there's like these beautiful traditions that my mom always told me about growing up. And when I got to visit El Salvador, I saw some of like the landmarks, like, oh, is this where my mom told me they had like those parties, and like those like cookouts, and people are like really, involved. I was able to experience that. And something that I know I experienced in San Pedro for sure was that things really do travel through the grapevine. Everybody knows everybody. People look out for each other. People will gossip about you just like any other place. But it's a very like well-connected community, at least in San Pedro. And I know for me, I'm really proud that people knew my mom's mom and my mom's parents. Like my grandparents were very respected people in San Pedro, and who people knew not to mess around with, and their children the same, right? And so I'm part of like this legacy of people that I think are really cool, who they were always community-centered people. And even though they were very hard, they were very kind in ways that people recognized. Like, you could go to my grandma if you needed something. Like she wasn't gonna let you leave that house without whatever it is you needed. So I know a lot of people have those similar stories, and I'm really, really proud of. And I hope that I can go back when it's safe one day, because I also heard that their Christmas are bangers. Like they have fireworks everywhere, everywhere, decorations everywhere, and I haven't had the chance to visit on Christmas yet, but I would love to go.
Yeah, hopefully this pandemic can, wrap up so that, because I'm trying to go to Haiti too. So like, there's a bunch of people that want to go to their homelands. Let us go to our homelands, please. Like,
let us visit. Let's get the vaccine. Let's get safe so that we're not carrying those like COVID-19
to our communities. Oh yeah,
I would also like it.
Exactly. And then you mentioned your family, and I know how important they are to you. Like, if you know Brenda, you know her social media, like, especially like your nephews, like she adores her family, giving them so many books, and pretty much if she has the money to, she will spoil them. Like she loves her family. She wants to give back to them. And so my question for you, it's a deep question. So what's the legacy that you want to leave for your family, especially your nephews?
Dabney, that's a hard
I
question.
know.
Like, I thought you were gonna ask me what book would I recommend my nephews. I was like, many.
I got the books are coming up. We're gonna get to the books.
What legacy?
The
Oh man,
books are the easy part.
it's like it is the easier part for me. What legacy? I think when I'm thinking about like my parents,
Mm-hmm.
I just hope that I continue the legacy they began.
Mm.
Like they're again, like I said, they're both from really huge, well-respected families in San Pedro, and my parents in particular have always been known as like these responsible, stand-up, kind, generous people. So I've always tried to live up to their legacy wherever I go. But for my brothers, and I'm thinking about my nephews, and so much of life that I've gone through, what I hope that I leave for them is the reality that they could be free. Like,
Mm.
you don't have to follow my path like I did. You don't have to think that college is the ladder for social mobility. You don't have to study something that, you think will make you money because you need it, because you want to support your family. Like, I hope that what I'm building is the type of sustainable ground that my nephews can see and say, like, okay, there's this kind of intergenerational freedom now that we're going to have, where like maybe they want to go to art school because they want to be artists, or like my baby nephew, he eats so much, so I'm like, maybe you're going to be a chef and maybe you can go to Paris one day and like, study and
Mm-hmm.
do what you need. But it doesn't have to be about bringing your family up. It doesn't have to be about bringing your family out of debt. It could be about you. And so
Mm.
that's kind of like the legacy that I hope to leave for my nephews. In particular, me and my little brother are first gen, so we do kind of feel those pressures of making it out with these degrees and profiting from them so that we can support our families in ways that we would like to support. So for him, I'm just hoping that, and he's done it. Like, I'm really proud of Robert. Like, he's found his own path at Boston College. He's become a leader of his own, and he's very different from me. I've always been a very serious, disciplined person, and
Mm-hmm.
Robert's kind of like the one that's like, life is short and you need to enjoy life. And basically he's like Soul, like the movie Soul. He just he really, he's
Such a
here to,
good movie.
it's such a beautiful movie. Everyone should put that in the notes. Everyone
Yes.
should watch that.
Go watch Soul. Disney
Soul.
Plus.
Love it. So that's kind of for him. I'm glad that he's already realizing that for himself. As much as I try to, I'm not gonna lie, as much as I try to dim his light, and I'm very practical, and I'm like, well, Robert, you need to think about this. He's very much like, it's gonna be okay. Like, we can think about joy, we can think about pleasure. It does not have to be tied to this burden.
Yeah.
So he's already there. He's already there, and so I'm proud of him because he did that on his own. But I would like to leave a different legacy for my nephews.
I love that. It's like joy doesn't have to be an afterthought, or like we have to do things to get to the joy. It's like, no, joy can come alongside like the journey of life for us too. Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing. So yeah, that's basically the end of all the serious stuff. But I got a fun little speed round to close out our interview, which went for a lot longer than I expected, but I love talking to you. So I hope that's okay. If you got some time, I'd love to do the speed round. This is book themed. Yes, your favorite thing. So don't think too hard about these questions. Just like whatever comes to mind, just like say it. How many questions do I got? 3. I got 7 questions. So are you ready?
Let's see. I'm nervous. We'll go.
There's one that's like my favorite question, and I'm really curious about your answer. So let's do it.
I can't think about it.
No, you'll think about it when you get there.
Okay, Dabney.
If you have to, you have to. That question, I'll let you think a little bit, but the others, I know you know the answer essentially.
Let's see. I'm ready.
Okay, so who's your favorite novelist?
Toni Morrison.
Okay, favorite poet?
That's hard. That's a hard one, actually. Actually, no. Mauricio Novea. He just published his first poetry chapbook. I love it. Memorias from the Beltway. He is my favorite poet.
Okay, people check him out. What are you currently reading right now?
I feel like that's an attack on a disability. Like, why are you attacking me?
You're just like,
I'm currently reading One of the Good Ones, which is a new YA novel, and I'm
Ooh.
really, really enjoying it, and I highly recommend it.
Ooh.
Heavy, a memoir by Kiese Laymon, which
Mm-hmm.
and I also highly recommend. Very beautiful writer, and the content is just like powerful. It'll stick with you forever. So I'm reading a lot of things, but that's the one I'm rereading, and then one of the good ones is the new thing I'm reading.
Okay. What do you want to read next?
It's a good question. I feel like I should say I want to read the stuff I need to read for my dissertation.
But you don't want to read.
I don't want to read that right now. I'm interested in reading novels. So what I want to read next is called The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, stories by Mariana Enriquez, which is the author, but translated by Megan McDowell. So I read her first book like last summer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a collection of short stories that were very haunting, very scary.
Ooh.
And I enjoy being scared for some reason. So I'm looking forward to her new book.
Is it like horror? Like scary?
It's like horror with thriller, psychological thriller, really more of it. Mm-hmm. But it'll scare you. It'll scare you.
What's a book that either made you cry or made you emotional?
The Undocumented Americans.
I have that book. I haven't read it yet, but I have it.
It made me cry. I read, like you said, I devour books, but that was one of the books that I had to stop and breathe and think, and it actually prompted me to begin journaling myself, because the book is a beautiful story. She's a PhD student, and so she weaved her scholarship, her interviews with undocumented Americans with her own personal narrative, as an undocumented American, and her family story. So she talks about what it means to grow up undocumented, but also like that lie that, you know, social mobility will come through higher ed while you're watching your parents deal with a sickness and maybe not have access to insurance. Like how the United States kind of debilitates so many migrants, especially undocumented migrants. So it was a very beautiful read. It was very hard to get through.
What's a book that you wanted to throw across the room? Whether it's because the book itself you didn't like, or like a character did something that made you angry and you were like, ah.
When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. That's a book you need to buy for your bookshelf.
Okay, When No One Is Watching.
It's a psychological thriller written by a Black woman, and I was scared the entire time. I was paranoid for 2 weeks. I didn't want to leave the apartment. I didn't want to let Javon leave the apartment. So it's very well written, but I wanted to throw the book because in that book, the main character is a Black woman who's watching her neighborhood to get gentrified. I believe it's Brooklyn, New York. And she falls in love with this white man. And before she was with this white man, he was with this white woman. This white woman is a Karen in all of the ways that Karen's.
Oh gosh.
And so every time I read something about her, I would just want to throw the book. But the book itself is brilliant. I love it. It's one of my favorite books ever.
Okay, I'm gonna have to. I can't watch psychological thrillers, but I can read them for some reason. And I probably will have the same reaction. I'll probably just want to throw it because of her. But I will, when no one is watching. And then last question is, what's a book you'd read over and over again? Like, no matter, every time you read it, it's like the first time you've read it and you always want to go back to it.
Can there be 3 or just 1?
Yeah, you could say 3.
I can say 3.
Because I can always get all those, like, this is also helping me out. I'm like, what does Brenda read so I can go out and read them?
I was like, actually, I'm going to say 4, but I'll start with Heavy. An American Memoir by Kiese Laymon. Like I said, like I just, wow. Like the way he interrogates himself and holds himself accountable in that memoir while thinking back to the relationship he had with his mother, while thinking back his relationship as a Black man to America. Like it's just so much, so many layers, so beautifully written. And you can tell he's inspired by James Baldwin. So the writing is quite gorgeous. So that's one that I would always reread. Definitely the Autobiography of Malcolm X. Like that book was it for me. Like that has been one of my bestest friends in life. And I would reread that any day, anytime. The third one would be When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roosts by Joan Morgan. I'm not sure if I taught parts of it when I was teaching Lucy. It might have been another year.
So. Yeah.
But she's a hip hop feminist. And so when I first read that book, it was the first time I saw, an author intellectually engaging with things that really mattered to me, hip hop, and what it means to have like this relationship to men of color when you're a woman of color. For her, specifically Black women and Black men. But as a woman of color, I really resonated with like these relationships you have with your partner, with your brothers. Like, what does that mean when you're listening to hip hop and the pleasure one gets from hip hop? So really love that book. So those are the three. The Undocumented Americans would have to be one of them. And Minor Feelings, an Asian American reckoning.
I need to read that too.
Yes, so that is another one that I would reread over and over again. Because again, it's the writing, but it's just the way that they engage with some intellectual, rigorous conversations without sounding like an academic press book. You know what I mean? Like it's beautiful. It touches your soul. Like you think about it often and you want to return to it both for form and content. So those are a few of the books that I'm like, yeah, I would reread.
We love books that are accessible to everybody and not just for academics, but I'm so excited. And yes, everyone, I'll make sure all those books are listed out in the show notes. Just to close out, thank you so much for doing this for me. I appreciate and love you so, so much. And I hope the listeners get like, this is just like a little like niblet. I don't know why I thought of a little niblet into like you and who you are. And I know that they're going to get a lot out of this, like from mentorship to just learning about Central America, a little bit more first generation students and like how they can uplift those communities. So yeah, I'm really grateful that you are here and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And if any of your listeners are listening to, I'm definitely someone who, if you just like slip into my DM, like I will answer and I will support you however I can or connect you to those who could. So if I could be a source of help for anyone, then I'm more than willing to.
Where can people follow you?
I answer very quickly on Instagram more than Twitter, but I'm on both. And my handle for both is Brenda Martinez _X. I did that a long, long time ago, and it's been my handle ever since. You can definitely find me on both.
Yeah, reach out to her. She's cool. She responds. Yeah, she's popping. And her Instagram's popping too. Like her stories, that's where you'll get all the book recommendations too. Because she puts every book that she reads on there.
Yes, I definitely do. I appreciate that.
All right. So for this week's reflections, we finally have a name. I gave y'all 2 choices to vote from, and y'all came through and voted for what you think this section would be called. And so the reflection section is now called Dabney's Debriefs. And I'm so excited that it finally has a name and something that we can all remember and think about. So for this week's Dabney Debrief, we talked about a lot of things on this episode, and I don't know about y'all, but I learned so much. One thing that really struck out to me is, again, our conversation on mentorship and the value and importance of mentorship, not just for first generation students while they're in school, but also once we graduate and start to live our lives, because there's still so much we don't know and have to navigate through. And I love this unconventional idea of what mentorship looks like and how it doesn't necessarily have to be someone you know personally. Like Brenda mentioned earlier, like you could go on LinkedIn and just follow someone and follow what they do and their achievements and how they go about things and learn. And that person's like a mentor to you. And it may just not be the one, you may just not know them personally. You may not be able to necessarily hit them up all the time. Like I can't hit up Issa Rae, for example, and just be like, yo, Issa, X, Y, and Z. I mean, you never know. You could always shoot your shot. The worst they could say is no, or they just don't respond. And that's okay. You live your life and you continue. But that person's just an unconventional type of mentor. And I think that's such a really cool idea and something that I want y'all to think more deeply about this week. So my question for y'all is, who are the conventional and unconventional mentors in your life, and how have they impacted you? And while you are thinking of them, I encourage you to send them a thank you note. Again, even if you don't really know them, I encourage you to send, just if you know how to contact them, whether that's through DMs or an email, I encourage you just to say, hey, I want you to know that I follow your work and I admire what you're doing. And I thank you for that because it's impacted me in X, Y, and Z way. So yeah, I encourage you all to think about that and let me know. Again, I will post these questions every week and I'll ask you guys what you think every week. Because I do want to know what you all are thinking. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For links and resources, check out the episode notes. If you liked what you heard, help your girl out by leaving a 5-star rating and a review. For more content and updates, follow the show's Insta at @the_uplift_podcast. And spread the word by telling your friends and sharing on social media. Subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. For any questions or business inquiries, you can email me at theupliftpodcast1@gmail.com. This was The Uplift with Dabney Brice. See you next time.